Story 1. The Shadow of Deltopia. The sun hung low over the rolling hills of California, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson as a beat-up sedan roared down the highway toward Isla Vista. Inside, 5 college seniors, Hunter, Damon, Benjamin, Armin, and our narrator, Ethan, were packed tighter than sardines, their laughter and the thump of bass-heavy music drowning out the hum of the engine. It was the spring of their final year at a small UC campus, a place dwarfed by the sprawling prestige of UCLA or Berkeley, and they were headed to UC Santa Barbara's infamous Deltopia, a day when the sleepy beach town transformed into a chaotic carnival of booze, music, and reckless abandon. Ethan had never been one for wild parties. A reserved economics major with a penchant for late-night study sessions, he'd spent most of his college years dodging the hedonistic rites of passage his peers embraced. But with graduation looming like a storm cloud, a flicker of rebellion had sparked within him. When Hunter, the group's charismatic ringleader, proposed the road trip, Ethan surprised even himself by saying yes. "Screw it," he'd muttered, climbing into the car, unaware that this decision would plunge him into a nightmare that would haunt him long after the music faded. The drive was a blur of inside jokes, greasy fast food, and Hunter's uncanny ability to charm strangers at gas stations. By the time they reached Isla Vista, the streets were already buzzing with anticipation. Deltopia wasn't just a party, it was a cultural phenomenon, a day when thousands of students descended on the town to lose themselves in a haze of alcohol and freedom. But for Ethan and his friends, the real challenge was finding a parking spot in a town overrun with revelers. After an hour of circling, Hunter's silver tongue worked its magic. A sorority girl, swayed by his grin, offered them her reserved spot. The group erupted in cheers, piling out of the car and into the electric atmosphere of the night before the main event. Hunter's sister, Mia, a junior at UCSB, welcomed them into her cramped apartment with open arms. The place was a kaleidoscope of college life. Posters plastered on the walls, empty beer cans stacked like trophies, and a faint haze of weed lingering in the air. Mia and her roommates were the epitome of chill, and the group quickly settled in, cracking open beers and swapping stories. But beneath the camaraderie, Ethan felt a twinge of unease. It was a fleeting sensation, brushed aside as the night unfolded into a blur of laughter and music. Little did he know, a shadow was already creeping toward them, one that would turn their carefree adventure into a descent into terror. That shadow had a name: Amir. To call him a friend would be generous. Amir was a leech, a loud, insecure figure who clung to Hunter's orbit like a moth to a flame. He was the kind of person who could turn a room sour with his need for attention, his voice always a decibel too loud, his stories always about himself. Ethan had never liked him, and the feeling was mutual among the group. Amir had a history of petty betrayals, spreading rumors, borrowing money he never repaid, and once, memorably, crashing a friend's car and blaming it on a mechanical failure. Hunter, ever the optimist, tolerated him out of pity, but the rest of the group had long since written him off. The trouble began when the group made a late-night run to a liquor store, their arms laden with bottles as they stepped back into the neon-lit street. There on the curb stood Amir, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his grin unnervingly wide. "What's up, guys?" he said, as if he'd been part of the plan all along. Ethan's stomach churned. No one had invited Amir. No one had even mentioned him. Yet here he was, falling into step with them as they walked back to Mia's apartment, his presence an unwelcome intrusion. Back at the apartment, Amir's behavior grew bolder. When Hunter reluctantly allowed him to use the bathroom, Amir seized the opportunity, striding up to Mia and declaring, "I'm staying here," before brushing past her. Mia, assuming he was part of the group, didn't protest, but Hunter's face darkened with fury. What followed was a tense confrontation, with Hunter laying into Amir for lying to his sister and crossing a line. Amir argued, pleaded, and finally stormed out, leaving a trail of muttered curses in his wake. The group thought that was the end of it. They were wrong. As the night wore on, the apartment filled with a haze of celebration. Beers flowed, music pulsed, and the group recounted the Amir incident with a mix of disbelief and amusement. But a chilling revelation cut through the revelry. Hunter discovered he'd been sharing his iPhone location with Amir. The realization hit like a thunderbolt. Amir hadn't just stumbled upon them, he'd tracked them to the liquor store, to the apartment, like a predator stalking prey. The group tried to laugh it off, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Amir's obsession ran deeper than they'd imagined. The next day, Deltopia erupted in full force. The streets of Isla Vista became a sea of bodies, with music blaring from every corner, and the air thick with the scent of sunscreen and spilled beer. Ethan, swept up in the chaos, found himself loosening up, dancing with strangers, and laughing until his sides ached. For a few glorious hours, the shadow of Amir faded. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the group returned to Mia's apartment, joined by 5 more friends. Over pizza and cheap wine, they recounted the day's antics until the conversation inevitably turned back to Amir. That's when Rylan, one of the newcomers, dropped a bombshell. "I've got Amir's location," he said, pulling out his phone. The group crowded around as he opened the app, and what they saw sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Amir's blue dot was pulsing directly on top of their location. Before anyone could process it, the dot began to move, racing away as if Amir had been watching them from a nearby car and was now fleeing. The room fell silent. "That's not just weird," Damon said, his voice low. "That's psychotic." The group tried to brush it off, diving back into the party, but the unease lingered. Ethan couldn't sleep that night, his mind racing with thoughts of Amir's unhinged behavior. Sometime after midnight, he was jolted awake by a sound that pierced the silence, the unmistakable crash of shattering glass. Heart pounding, he sat up, scanning the darkened room. His friends were sprawled across the floor, passed out from the day's excesses. No one else had stirred. The sound had come from deeper in the apartment, and Ethan knew he was the only one awake to face whatever or whoever was out there. Grabbing an empty wine bottle as a makeshift weapon, Ethan crept toward the living room, his pulse thundering in his ears. The sliding door to the balcony lay in ruins, shards of glass glittering in the moonlight. In the center of the floor sat a large rock, its edges jagged and menacing. Ethan's gut twisted. This was no accident. This was Amir. Before he could act, a faint movement caught his eye. The handle of a closet door twitched, as if someone were testing it from the other side. Fear gripped him, colder and sharper than anything he'd ever felt. He imagined Amir lurking behind that door, his eyes wild with resentment, his hands clutching something far deadlier than a rock. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay calm. Instead of confronting the intruder, he slipped back to the bedroom and shook Hunter awake, whispering the situation in frantic tones. Together they approached the living room, Hunter's broad frame a reassuring presence. But when they reached the closet, the door was ajar, the space inside empty. Ethan's relief was short-lived. Hunter reached into the closet and pulled out a gleaming kitchen knife, its blade catching the moonlight. The implications hit Ethan like a freight train. Amir had been hiding there, armed and waiting, mere moments ago. Had Ethan opened that door, he might not be standing here now. The group sprang into action, waking the house and sweeping the apartment for any sign of Amir. They called the police, but the response was maddeningly dismissive. "Deltopia brings out the crazies," the officer said, scribbling a report. "Property damage is par for the course." With no concrete evidence linking Amir to the break-in, the police could do little. Frustrated and shaken, the group packed up the next morning, Hunter lingering to ensure Mia and her roommates were safe. Before they left, Hunter typed out a scathing message to Amir, pouring his rage into every word. But when he hit send, the message failed to deliver. Amir had blocked him. A quick check revealed he'd blocked them all. Weeks passed, and Amir vanished like a ghost. No texts, no sightings, no trace. Ethan tried to move on, throwing himself into his studies and job applications. But the fear lingered. Amir knew where they lived, where they hung out. The thought of him lurking out there, nursing his grudges, kept Ethan awake at night. One evening, as he sat in his dorm room, a notification pinged on his phone. An email from Mia. Attached was a blurry security camera still from her apartment complex, time-stamped the night of the break-in. In the grainy image, a figure stood in the shadows, face obscured, but posture unmistakable. It was Amir. Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't over. He forwarded the image to the police, hoping it would spur them to action. As he waited for a response, he couldn't shake the feeling that Amir was still watching, waiting for his next move. The carefree days of Deltopia were gone, replaced by a lingering dread that followed Ethan like a shadow, a reminder that some debts are paid not in forgiveness, but in fear. Story 2. The Highway Mirage. The Texas sun blazed mercilessly over the endless stretch of Highway 277, its heat shimmering off the asphalt like a mirage. In the spring of 1996, 3 young Air Force recruits, Arthi, Sebas, and Kay, were cruising toward Austin in Kay's battered SUV, their spirits high and their laughter louder than the country tunes crackling through the radio. Fresh out of basic training and stationed at a sleepy airbase in San Angelo, they were itching for a taste of freedom, a chance to escape the monotony of military life for a single glorious day. Arthi, a wiry 24-year-old from Mississippi, had joined the Air Force to outrun his past, a small-town life weighed down by expectations and regrets. As a communications specialist, he thrived on precision and observation, skills that had already earned him respect among his peers. Sebas, a lanky Texan with a quick wit, was the group's jokester, always ready with a quip or a prank. Kay, the de facto leader, was a no-nonsense firecracker, her sharp tongue matched only by her loyalty to her friends. Together, they were a trio bound by late-night talks and shared dreams of something bigger than the base's chain-link fences. The road trip had been Sebas's idea, a spontaneous plan to hit Austin's vibrant music scene and soak up a city that pulsed with life. Kay had volunteered to drive, her SUV packed with snacks, a cooler of sodas, and a playlist that swung from Nirvana to George Strait. The highway unfurled before them, a ribbon of possibility cutting through the scrubland. For the first hour, the journey was pure bliss. Windows down, wind whipping through their hair, and the open road promising adventure. Then Sebas's voice cut through the music, sharp and curious. "Y'all see that car back there?" He craned his neck, peering through the rear window. Arthi followed his gaze, spotting a dark Tahoe trailing them at a steady distance. "It pulled off the shoulder right after we passed," Sebas said, his tone laced with suspicion. Kay glanced in the rearview mirror, her brow furrowing. "Probably nothing," she said, but her hands tightened on the wheel. To test the theory, Kay eased into the left lane. The Tahoe followed. She switched back, her movements deliberate. Again, the Tahoe mirrored her, its presence growing more ominous with each maneuver. Arthi's training kicked in, his mind cataloging details. Tinted windows, no visible plates, a hulking silhouette that seemed to absorb the sunlight. "This ain't right," he muttered, his Mississippi drawl thickening with unease. Before anyone could respond, red and blue lights flared behind them, the Tahoe's grille pulsing with authority. "Undercover cop," Kay said, her voice steady but tense. She pulled onto the shoulder, the SUV's tires crunching against gravel. Arthi's eyes stayed glued to the side mirror, watching as the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. But what emerged wasn't the crisp silhouette of a highway patrolman. The man was clad in black tactical gear, his movements precise yet predatory. No badge, no insignia, only a small, unreadable patch on his sleeve hinted at any affiliation. He didn't approach Kay's window as expected. Instead, he lingered behind the SUV, his gaze sweeping over the vehicle with an intensity that set Arthi's nerves on edge. "He's not acting like a cop," Arthi whispered, his voice barely audible. Sebas nodded, his usual humor replaced by a steely focus. The man's eyes seemed to pierce through the rear window, studying their belongings, a duffel bag, a cooler, Kay's military bumper sticker, proclaiming, "Proud to serve." Arthi's instincts screamed that something was wrong, but he forced himself to stay calm, his training anchoring him in the face of uncertainty. Sebas, never one to sit idly, rolled down his window and called out, "Officer, everything okay?" The man's head snapped toward them, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he strode to Kay's window, his boots crunching against the gravel. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. Kay complied, her movements slow and deliberate, but Arthi noticed her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the documents. The man retreated to his Tahoe, leaving the trio in a suffocating silence. Minutes dragged on, each second amplifying their unease. "This guy's not right," Sebas hissed. "No radio chatter, no backup, no nothing." Arthy's mind raced, piecing together the anomalies. The lack of a marked vehicle, the man's unorthodox behavior, the way he'd studied their SUV like a hunter sizing up prey. "We need to stay sharp," Arthy said, his voice low. "If he comes back, we don't give him an inch." When the man finally returned, he wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the Tahoe, their black gear mirroring his own. Arthy's pulse quickened, his training urging him to assess the threat. Three men, no visible weapons, but their postures screamed readiness. The lead man leaned toward Kay's window, his eyes narrowing. "Your father in the army?" he asked, nodding toward the bumper sticker. Kay let out a nervous laugh. "Nah, that's me. And them," she said, gesturing to Arthy and Sebas. "We're all Air Force." The words hung in the air, and Arthy caught a subtle shift in the man's demeanor, a tightening of his jaw, a glance back at his companions. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then abruptly the man straightened. "Drive slower," he said, thrusting Kay's documents back through the window. "Consider this a warning." Before Kay could respond, the three men returned to their Tahoe and peeled out, the vehicle vanishing into the heat haze. The trio sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like dust. "Those weren't cops," Sebas said, his voice shaking with conviction. "They were gonna do something to us." Kay gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. "Let's just get to Austin," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the trip was a blur of music and neon lights, but the encounter cast a long shadow. They laughed and danced in Austin's dive bars, but the memory of those black-clad figures lingered, a splinter in their minds. Back at the base, life resumed its rhythm, drills, shifts, the hum of routine. But a week later, Arthy and Sebas were sprawled in the rec room, half watching the local news, when a story froze them in their tracks. The reporter's voice was grim. A young couple had been found dead in a ditch along Highway 277, their bodies robbed and discarded. The details were sparse, but one fact stood out like a beacon. A black Tahoe, stolen months earlier, had been found abandoned near the scene. Arthy's heart sank, his mind flashing back to the tinted windows, the predatory gaze. Sebas's face was ashen. "That's them," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's the guys." The trio wasted no time. They marched to the San Angelo police station, spilling every detail of their encounter. The officer listened, his expression skeptical but attentive. "Could be unrelated," what he said. But he took their statement, promising to pass it along to investigators. As they left, Arthy felt a pang of guilt, wondering if they could have done more, said something sooner. The thought of that couple, their lives snuffed out on the same highway, gnawed at him. Months later, a letter arrived at the base, addressed to Arthy. It was from the San Angelo PD, a rare follow-up. The Black Tahoe had been linked to a string of highway robberies, the perpetrators a rogue militia group posing as law enforcement. The trio's statement had helped build the case, leading to arrests that dismantled the operation. Arthy read the letter in silence, his mind drifting back to that sun-scorched highway. Kay's bumper sticker, a simple declaration of pride, had likely saved their lives, a talisman against a fate they'd narrowly escaped. Years later, long after Arthy had left the Air Force and settled into civilian life, the memory of that day remained vivid. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now carried a warning. Danger could wear any face, even one cloaked in authority. And somewhere in the vast expanse of America's highways, the ghosts of that black Tahoe still roamed, a reminder of how close they'd come to joining them. Story 3. The Thief in the Mirror. The highway stretched like a scar across the American heartland, its edges blurred by the heat of a late summer day. 10 years ago, Daniel, a 32-year-old graphic designer from West Paterson, New Jersey, was driving solo toward Fort Worth, Texas, his old Camry humming with the weight of a long-overdue reunion. He hadn't seen his parents in years, their voices on the phone a faint tether to a hometown he'd left behind. This trip was a chance to mend old wounds, to rediscover the man he'd been before the city's grind had worn him down. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Somewhere in the no man's land between Arkansas and Oklahoma, the Camry began to falter, its engine coughing like a smoker on his last pack. Daniel cursed under his breath, coaxing the car to the shoulder as the dashboard lit up with warnings. The landscape was desolate, miles of scrubby fields and twisted trees, the road empty save for the occasional tumbleweed. Popping the hood, Daniel stared at the tangle of metal and wires, his knowledge of cars limited to oil changes and tire pressure. He was stalling, hoping for a miracle, when the rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. A white pickup truck, its paint chipped and faded, pulled up behind him. Daniel noted the absence of a front plate, a detail that struck him as odd but not alarming. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out, his boots kicking up dust. He was in his mid-30s, maybe older, with a weathered face framed by curly hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a trim in a decade. His hands were calloused, his posture that of a man who'd spent his life wrestling machines into submission. To Daniel, he looked like a rougher version of himself, a mirror reflecting a life he might have lived in another universe. "Trouble?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but warm. Daniel explained the situation, grateful for the interruption. The man introduced himself as Ray, a mechanic who knew a thing or two about engines. Without waiting for an invitation, Ray leaned over the hood, his hands moving with the confidence of experience. Daniel felt a surge of relief, already calculating how to repay this stranger's kindness. But as Ray worked, his demeanor shifted, his eyes darting to the horizon as if expecting company. After a few minutes, Ray stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Gonna need a compression tester," he said, his tone clipped. "Without it, this thing ain't moving." Daniel nodded, clueless but trusting. Ray glanced at his truck, then back at Daniel. "Got a buddy who can bring one over. Mind if I use your phone? Mine's dead." Daniel didn't hesitate, handing over his phone with a smile. It was a mistake he'd regret for years. In one fluid motion, Ray's hand dipped into his jacket and emerged with a pistol, its barrel glinting in the sunlight. "Sit down," he said, his voice stripped of warmth. "Don't do anything stupid." Daniel's world tilted, the reality of the situation crashing over him like a wave. He sank to the ground, his mind racing, but his body frozen. Ray moved with practiced efficiency, rifling through Daniel's pockets, taking his wallet, his backpack, and even demanding the phone's password. Then, without another word, he climbed into his truck and sped off, leaving Daniel alone in the dust. The aftermath was a blur of rage and humiliation. A passing motorist eventually stopped, helping Daniel get the Camry running and offering directions to Fort Worth. The visit with his parents was bittersweet, overshadowed by the violation of the robbery. Back in New Jersey, Daniel threw himself into recovery, canceling cards, replacing IDs, rebuilding his life piece by piece. But the thief had taken more than money. He'd stolen Daniel's sense of security, leaving a wound that refused to heal. 6 months later, the wound reopened. A letter arrived from an unfamiliar bank, congratulating Daniel on a new line of credit he hadn't opened. Then another, this time from Best Buy, detailing over $1,000 in charges from a town in Tennessee. The realization hit like a punch. His Social Security card had been in his wallet. The thief, Ray, or whatever his real name was, had everything he needed to become Daniel, to weave himself into the fabric of his life. What followed was a descent into chaos. Daniel's credit report became a battlefield, littered with unauthorized accounts and inquiries. Every day brought a new violation: a credit card in Georgia, a loan in Alabama, medical records in his name from a hospital he'd never visited. The police were sympathetic but powerless without a suspect. Daniel filed reports, froze his credit, and followed every protocol, but the thief was a ghost, always one step ahead. Desperation turned Daniel into a detective. He transformed his life, dedicating every spare moment to tracking the man who'd stolen his identity. He set up alerts, scoured social media, and dug through online forums, his obsession growing with each dead end. One sleepless night, on a whim, he turned to Craigslist, focusing on cities linked to the fraud. In Jackson, Tennessee, a listing caught his eye: power tools and electronics, the exact items charged to his Best Buy card. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. Heart pounding, Daniel responded to the listing, posing as an interested buyer. The seller was cautious but eager, agreeing to meet at a public lot the next day. Daniel wrestled with the urge to confront the thief himself, to face the man who turned his life upside down. But reason prevailed. Instead, he contacted the Jackson police, sharing every detail of his case. To his relief, they took him seriously, agreeing to stake out the meetup. The next day, Daniel waited, his nerves frayed as he refreshed his email for updates. Hours later, a call from the Jackson PD changed everything. The seller, driving a red pickup, had panicked at the sight of patrol cars and fled, crashing into a ditch. Under questioning, he crumbled, admitting the items weren't his and pointing the finger at a friend. That friend, Ray, was the linchpin of a small but vicious ring targeting travelers across the South. With the seller's cooperation, the police unraveled the operation, arresting Ray and his 2 accomplices. Justice was bittersweet. Daniel's life slowly regained its footing, but the scars remained. The thief had taken more than money or credit. He'd stolen Daniel's trust, his peace. Yet in the ashes of that betrayal, Daniel found resilience. He'd fought back, not with fists, but with persistence, turning victim into victor. As he stood in his apartment, the weight of the ordeal lifting, he vowed to never let fear define him. The highway might be long and treacherous, but Daniel was no longer its prey. He was its survivor.